These videos simply provide a presentation in video format of the book, Predator at the Chessboard by Ward Farnworth. The book is freely available online at http://www.chesstactics.org. White to move. What is the best move? Again we find black's king and queen adjacent on the same diagonal with white's queen pinning black's. White's window of opportunity is small, he has one move to take offensive measures against black's queen or defensive measures to protect his own. Think offensively first. With one queen pinning another on a diagonal, a cross pin against the target will have to be along a rank or file, which means it will have to be imposed by a rook. Does white have a way to bring a rook to bear against the pinned queen? Indeed, he already has a rook on the d-file. The only trouble is that white's own bishop is in the way. This is a case where the crosspin can be created not by moving a piece into position to attack but by moving a piece out of the way of an attacker. So where should white move the bishop? Remember the purpose of the exercise, we're trying to make it too costly for black to play queen takes queen. Suppose the bishop is out of the picture and black does play queen takes queen. With the bishop gone, white would then play rook takes rook, check. A check, but nothing more. It would become a familiar mating pattern, however, if the rook's attack were supported by the bishop. White thus should play bishop moves to e7. This not only discovers an attack on the queen by white's rook, but also prepares the way, if black plays queen takes queen, for rook takes rook, checkmate. Black therefore can't move his queen, the best he can do is knight takes bishop. White then has rook takes queen, winning the queen for a bishop and a rook. Moving the bishop to e7 is a little counterintuitive because it looks like it can be taken so easily with queen takes bishop. Of course it can't, since black's queen is pinned, but what the eye sees is that retreating the bishop to c5 or b4 looks safer and more appealing. To discipline yourself to consider possibilities such as bishop moves to e7, it helps to very deliberately look at moves that put your piece's end prize to, exposed to capture by, the pinned piece. Such moves are easy for your opponent as well as for you to overlook. White to move. What is the best move? Essentially the same concept, but a move earlier. As yet there is no pin in place. White's thinking might be stimulated by the presence of his bishop and rook on the same file leading toward e8, almost a mating pattern, but black's queen is in the way. Another approach to the position is to just consider every check and its consequences. White has queen moves to a3, check. To this suppose black replies queen moves to e7, interposing his queen and walking it into a pin. Now black threatens queen takes queen, so what is white to do? Again, take the offensive by adding a vertical pin. Here as in the previous case the rook is brought into the fray by simply moving the bishop on e4 out of the way, and here as before the best placement for the bishop is determined by the demands of the crosspin white wants to achieve. The point is to imagine black playing queen takes queen and to place the bishop so that it has the maximum possible usefulness afterwards. That means bishop moves to c6 is best, because then after black if queen takes queen white will have rook takes bishop, checkmate. Just as he had a similar mate in the previous position. We have been assuming black would interpose his queen in reply to white's queen moves to a3. Now we can see that would be a blunder. His better option would be to remove his king to g8. But then you should see another pattern, a classic discovered attack via bishop takes at h7, check. Followed a move later by rook takes queen, the start of a winning sequence for white, though not so devastating as if black had played queen moves to e7. Hence the importance of seeing the kernel of the discovery on the e-file from the very beginning. However it gets used, the potential for it dominates all the variations that might follow from white's check. White to move. What is the best move? A case where the critical pattern takes yet a little longer to come into view. Black's king and queen are adjacent but can't now be pinned effectively, they are on a diagonal, so the only white piece usable to impose a pin would be the queen, and the queen has nothing it can do here. You generally don't pin one queen with another by attacking it, because then your opponent just plays queen takes queen. To create a pin of one queen by another you usually need to check the enemy king with your queen and force the enemy queen to interpose. Alright, so play with some checks. White has two to consider, queen takes rook, which just loses the queen, and rook takes at c5, which at least is safe, so consider what follows from it. Black moves his king to b8. Now what? Look for your next check. White's queen can attack the king in a new way by moving to e5. Of course when you imagine this sequence you have to remember that white's first rook move leaves e5 vacant. Now black is forced to interpose his queen on d6, and you see the emergence of the pattern we have been considering lately. Black has put his king and queen on the same diagonal, with his queen pinned by yours. What do you do? By now you know, consider throwing a rook at it and remember that you have more than one. Thus the right move is our pawn from f1 moves to d1. Test it by asking what this would make possible if black were to play queen takes queen. White's response would be rook takes rook, checkmate. In other words, black's queen is crosspinned to a mating square, and so is lost. White to move. What is the best move? Other ways to constrain the pinned queen. While we're on the subject of the pinned queen, consider a few other positions where it can't bite back against the piece that pins it. These studies don't involve cross pins, but they are similar in important respects. In each of them you have the queen pinned, and if it captures your pinning piece, you achieve mate or some other decisive gain. The most salient facts of the position pictured here are two: the alignment of black's king and queen with nothing between them on the g-file, creating the kernel of a pin, and the coordination of white's queen and d7 rook, both trained on f7 and almost able to deliver mate with queen takes at f7. Anytime your queen can land on a square next to the enemy king and get backup from one of your other pieces, you have a threat worth exploring. A pin against black's queen would need to be delivered vertically by white's queen, which can't get there, or his d4 rook, much better anyway as a pinning tool, of course, because it's cheaper. A piece that tries to pin the queen usually needs protection, and the rook would find none on g4. But it sometimes is the case that a queen pinned to its king is performing important defensive functions that constrain its ability to lash out at a piece that pins it. That is so here. Imagine black playing queen takes rook g4 and see that queen takes at f7 would have a new significance, attacking the king not only with protection but without any black guards to worry about. Black's king would have nothing to do but move to h8. White then would have a crushing queen and rook battery on the 7th rank, allowing him to play queen takes at h7, checkmate. So black's queen wouldn't be free to take the rook that pins it after all, and rook moves to g4 therefore wins. White to move. What is the best move? You can see where this is going. Black is threatening mate. But he also has his own king and queen on adjacent diagonal squares, so white looks for a pin and finds it with bishop moves to d4. It looks perfect because the bishop gets protection from the rook on d1. But this position illustrates a risk to consider when building a pin. Your opponent may be able to interpose something between the pinning and pinned pieces. In this case black will play pawn from e6 moves to e5. Now what? One option is simply to take the pawn with bishop takes at e5, renewing the pin on the queen. The problem is that white's bishop would then lose its protection from the rook. Still, don't assume the idea must therefore be a failure. Imagine black actually playing queen takes bishop. Ask what would then be possible for white, especially by way of an attack on black's king. Really white has just one piece usable for that purpose, his own queen, which he can play to black h6. Fortunately that's enough. Queen moves to h6 is mate because the black king's position is so constrained. A king stuck in the corner with no pawn cover is at great risk. So it turns out that black's queen is not free to take the bishop that pins it, and that bishop moves to d4, followed by bishop takes at e5, is a winning sequence for white. The general point is that when you have a possible pin, don't lightly dismiss the idea just because your pinning piece could be taken. Pause to ask what would be possible on the board as it then would look, asking the same questions about that resulting position, looking for possible checks, forks, and the like, that you ask about the board in front of you. Black to move. What is the best move? This time it's black who sees that white has left his king and queen adjacent on a diagonal. He looks for a pinning tool and finds it in the dark squared bishop, which he can play to g5. What will white do? He might play queen takes bishop, but his more immediate defense is the same as in the previous position. Pawn from f2 moves to f4, interposing a pawn and disturbing the pin. Black follows the continuation in his mind. Bishop takes at f4, then white plays queen takes bishop. It looks bad, but before writing off the idea, consider the consequences of white's feared move. Ask in particular what pieces black can direct at white's king, and with what result, once the queen leaves its station. Here the answer is that black has a battery of queen and rook on the b-file. It's another case like the one a moment ago where your queen can land near the enemy king, and with protection, and it's another case where the move results in mate, this time on the spot with queen takes at b2. So again the pin of the queen, this time with bishop moves to g5, works fine despite the fact that the pinning piece has no defenders. The general lesson of these positions resembles a point from the section on knight forks. If you have a pin, or fork, but it looks unplayable because the piece you would use to execute it can be taken, ask what the consequences of such a capture would be and especially what checks would then become possible for you. A potential fork or pin is a type of forcing move that often costs your opponent material if he doesn't capture the piece making the threat. Forcing him to make that capture means you're controlling the movement of the pieces on the board, which in turn is the key to creating tactical strikes of all sorts. From time to time a failed pin can be better than a successful one, as this position shows. White to move. What is the best move? You see black's king and queen adjacent on the same diagonal and so immediately think about pinning possibilities. The only piece white has available for the purpose is his queen, which he can play to a 3. Obviously black can just reply queen takes queen. The question is what would then become possible for white. Imagine the board as it would look after that little sequence and you see 3 white pieces trained on the black king's general position, the bishop on b5, the rook on d1, and the knight on e4. Since white by assumption would be losing the queen, the question had better be whether he can use those pieces to mate afterwards. Think in checks. White would have just one, rook moves to d8, check. To this black would have to respond king moves to e7. Now notice that black's king would be trapped on the 7th rank, white's rook would seal off the 8th rank, and his knight would seal off the king's only flight squares on the 6th. So now what? White plays the simple rook moves to e8, checkmate. A variation on the standard mating pattern where the rook mates with help from the bishop, which protects it and seals off critical flight squares. The point of all this is that white can attack black's queen without fear that black will play queen takes queen, for black's queen is frozen in place by the mate threat. Black will have to reply to the pin by playing pawn from g7 moves to g6 to create an escape route for his king. White's task then is to go to work destroying the pinned queen's defenders, the king and the knight on g8, so that the pin is made profitable. First white uses rook moves to d8, check, forcing black's king away to g7. Then he plays rook takes knight, check, which loses the rook for a knight, after black plays rook takes rook, but destroys the last of the black queen's defenders. Notice that although the pin of black's queen was dissolved back when the king moved away from f8, Since white has operated with checks, black has had no time to play queen takes queen. Now the black queen has been left loose, so white takes it with his. Once you realize how much work is being done here by the threat white's rook creates on the d-file, a different idea may occur to you. Black can disrupt white's plans by replying to queen moves to a3 with bishop moves to d7, blocking the white rook's path. It looks good because white can't afford to play rook takes bishop. That would permit black to play queen takes queen without worrying about the mate threat discussed a moment ago. Do you see why? If white then tries rook moves to d8, check. He loses the rook to rook takes rook. When black moved his bishop to d7, he freed his rook on a8 to protect the back rank. But white has a different winning sequence instead. He plays queen takes queen, allowing the recapture knight takes queen, and then he has bishop takes bishop d7, as black's bishop is left loose. If black recaptures the queen with his king rather than his knight, white plays rook takes bishop, check. Instead, black's king can't recapture because white's rook has protection from his bishop. White to move. What is the best move? Other patterns and applications. Pinning a piece to take its protectorate. Our discussion of pins has been focused on how they can be used to capture the pinned piece. But there is another whole family of uses for a pin, equally useful and important. By pinning a piece you also render it unable to serve any defensive purpose. Any pieces it formerly guarded are left unprotected or less protected. A pin thus may enable you to take material other than the pinned piece, or pinned pawn, or to gain access to squares that can lead to checkmate. In the simple position we start with to the left, white's queen is under attack by black's bishop from c8. Resist the temptation to think defensively. If possible you don't want to spend your time backing away from black's threats. There are two ways to instead see an offensive idea here. One is to examine any captures you can make and to inquire into the protection enjoyed by their targets. Here the most obviously contested square is f6, black's knight there is attacked twice, by white's queen and by the rook behind it on f3. The knight appears to be guarded twice but isn't, since its fellow knight on g8 is pinned. The f6 knight is protected only by its queen on b2. As the target is attacked more times than it is defended, white wins it. 1 queen takes knight, check. Queen takes queen, 2. Rook takes queen. The other way to see the idea would be to follow out the lines from black's king and observe what might be obvious enough anyway. If you were playing this position, black's knight on g8 is pinned. You immediately follow up with a look not only at whether the knight can be taken but at what it is supposed to protect. Here you see that the pin of the knight leaves black's other knight attacked twice and really protected only once. Black to move. What is the best move? Starting from white's king and working outward, you find a pin of the bishop on d3. One question to ask is whether you can take it, another, however, is what it is supposed to be protecting that might now be vulnerable because of the bishop's paralysis. Here the bishop helps protect the pawns on c4 and e4. The pawn of interest is the one on c4, as black already attacks it twice. Because of the pin on the bishop, the pawn is protected only once. Black can take it next move. White to move. What is the best move? Black has just played his bishop to c5, where it checks white's king. White considers his options: capture the bishop with his queen, out of the question since the bishop has protection, move the king to h1, plausible, or interpose something between his king and black's bishop. What interpositions does he have? Bishop moves to d4 would seem to work, the bishop would have protection from the queen on c4. Any problem with this? Yes, when you interpose a piece to block a check, remember that this causes the interposing piece to become pinned. Any defensive purpose it had been serving is no longer being served, any pieces it was protecting may no longer be protected. So before interposing the bishop, white must ask whether bishop is supposed to be protecting anything. It is, the knight on e5, which will be lost to queen takes knight if the bishop is paralyzed. So bishop moves to d4 is the wrong move for white, he should move his king. Black to move. What is the best move? Now an example of how the pattern just viewed can emerge from a forcing sequence. This time the queens are faced off against each other. A natural question to ask is what it would take to enable you black to play queen takes queen. White's queen is guarded by the knight on f2. Black could simply take the knight with his bishop, but this wouldn't get anywhere. White would reply queen takes queen, and then after black recaptures white would have king takes bishop and the sequence would be a wash. But the bishop aimed at white's knight has another significance. There are ways of eliminating an obstacle besides capturing or chasing it. Perhaps it can be pinned if its king can be brought into line with it. Or just inspect the consequences of any checks you give. Either train of thought leads you to rook moves to e1, check. White's reply is forced, king takes rook. Suddenly the knight on f2 is pinned, and therefore incapable of doing any defensive work. Black has queen takes queen. Pins meant to capture the pinned piece. The sorts of pins studied before this section can be brought into existence in many different ways. As we saw, often you can just slide your pinning piece into place to create the pin and then start throwing attackers at the target. But that method usually won't work if your goal instead is to take something the pinned piece protects. The reason is that once you impose the pin, your opponent still remains free to move the target, i.e., the piece protected by the piece you have pinned. There are exceptions, but usually if you want to pin a piece to take something it guards, you must bring the pin into existence with forcing moves that allow you to keep the initiative and don't give your opponent time to move the target. The classic means of doing this is with a check, often a check sacrifice that forces your opponent to move his king into line with one of its fellow pieces. In effect, you have caused him to create the pin for you, and now it is your move again. Anything the pinned piece used to protect suddenly is loose, and you can grab it. This case introduces the point. White to move. What is the best move? Black has just moved his queen out where it can attack White's queen. White's queen is loose, Black's queen has protection. White can move his queen, protect it, or play queen takes queen, but it would be rash to do any of these things too quickly. Think more aggressively, considering how Black's queen is protected and whether anything can be done to undermine its security. What you should see is not just that the queen is guarded by its knight, but that the knight is attacked by White's bishop. Bishop takes knight won't work, as it is met with queen takes queen. The significance of the bishop, rather, is that it also is aimed through the knight at a square adjacent to Black's king. If the king could be moved over, the knight would be pinned, and then it might as well not exist so far as the Black queen is concerned. How to move the king over? With a check, and sacrifice, rook moves to d8, check. Black is required to play king takes rook, or king moves to e7, which brings the king into line with the knight and suddenly leaves Black's queen without a defender. Now White plays queen takes queen and wins the queen without a recapture. Black could not reply to rook moves to d8, check. With knight takes rook, of course, because his c6 knight is pinned. Now of course another way to see the idea here is to experiment with the consequences of any checks you can give. White only has two, and one of them is rook moves to d8, check. Requiring Black's king to move. When you make the enemy king move, ask whether any fresh pins have appeared. Here this leads you to the f6 knight, and you ask not only whether you can take the knight but whether its paralysis has consequences for anything it is supposed to protect, like Black's queen. This position is an example of the point made in the previous frame regarding forcing moves. Suppose Black's king already were on d8, because White played rook moves to d8 a move earlier, and White's bishop were on, say, e3. If the bishop went to g5 to pin the Black queen's guard, nothing would come of it, it wouldn't be a forcing move, so Black would be free to move his queen to safety or, here, to play queen takes queen. But using a check sacrifice dictates Black's move in reply and leaves him no time to prevent White from playing queen takes queen once the knight is pinned by Black's own hand. For the sake of completeness, notice that White has another good pinning possibility here, 2, 1 queen takes queen, knight takes queen, 2 rook moves to e1, and now White's rook pins the knight on e4. Black can rush a defender to the knight's side with bishop moves to f5, but then White can add another attacker with pawn from f2 moves to f3. The knight will be lost. But it's even better to win a queen for a rook, as you do with the primary sequence. You might have seen this second idea first, though, and in that case the position shows the importance of looking beyond the first good tactical move you see. There may be something even better. Black to move. What is the best move? Familiar principle, different context. Black's queen and white's queen attack each other, with each enjoying protection from one of its fellow pieces. Don't just think about whether to exchange queens, think about whether you can knock the legs out from under white's queen by paralyzing its guard. Or just think about any checks black can give. He has two to consider: queen moves to h2, check. Losing the queen without benefit, and bishop takes at f2, check. Which forks white's king and rook and invites the reply king takes bishop. What would be the significance of that exchange? When a move would force the enemy king to change squares, look for fresh pins. Here white's king would step behind the knight on f3, causing it to become abruptly paralyzed by a pin from black's queen. Having seen that you have a check which results in a pin, ask not just whether the pinned piece can then be taken but whether it was serving defensive purposes that might now be unattended. The knight was guarding white's queen, so now black takes it with queen takes queen. Shouldn't black worry that moving his queen to play that capture also will release white's knight from its pin? Yes, he should worry about it, but black's rook on f7 picks up the pin once the queen leaves the file. White to move. What is the best move? The current point one more time in a slightly different visual setting. Its inclusion here may be tedious, your patience with it will be rewarded in the next frame, however, which usefully shows how it came into existence. White's queen pins black's queen, but can't capture it profitably because it is protected by the knight on e7. If white plays bishop takes knight, black plays the usual queen takes queen. As before, white can steal black's queen if he can use forcing moves to create a pin of its defender. Again he plays rook moves to d8, check. Again black plays king takes rook, again white now plays queen takes queen with impunity. White to move. What is the best move? Here's the same position slightly earlier so you can see how it was created. White has nothing at the moment, so he plays with any checks he can inflict. He has 2, rook moves to d8, check. And queen moves to a4, check. Rook moves to d8, check. Loses the rook, though it moves the king over and causes black's knight to become pinned, a good thing to see, but not yet useful. Queen moves to a4, check. Loses nothing, and so is of particular interest. Carefully consider black's possible replies, any ways he can interpose something between his king and white's queen, move his king out of check, or capture white's queen. Here black's options are 3, a. Black can move his king to f8. White asks what checks he then would have, and sees bishop moves to h6. This drives the king onto g8. White asks what checks he then would have, and sees queen moves to e8, checkmate. Conclusion: if black initially replies king moves to f8, white mates. b. Black can interpose his knight on c6. When you imagine an enemy piece moving, always keep an eye on how this affects any lines it used to occupy. Here the knight's departure from e7 would vacate the path of white's bishop to d8, a square adjacent to black's king and already attacked by white's rook. White would be about ready to play rook moves to d8, checkmate. The only hindrance would be black's queen. But it can be drawn out of position if white plays queen takes knight, check. For then if black replies queen takes queen, white mates with the rook. c. Black's final possibility is to interpose his queen at c6. Now analysis proceeds as in the previous frame, with white again looking always for his next check and this time finding rook moves to d8, check. It is worth going over these variations until each of them and the process of thinking all of them through is clear. White to move. What is the best move? Look for capturing opportunities for white and you see rook takes rook, but black's rook has protection. So turn your attention to the piece that guards the rook, the bishop on f5. You can't capture it, and it protects nothing else you can capture. You might consider chasing it away with pawn from g3 moves to g4, but then black simply plays rook takes rook himself. After you recapture bishop takes rook, he moves his bishop to e6 and has lost nothing. The position comes apart promptly, however, once you notice that the f5 bishop is aligned with its king and thus is pinnable. Bishop moves to g4 does the trick for white. A bishop pinning a bishop can be awkward, of course, but not when the pinned bishop is supposed to be protecting a more valuable piece. Suddenly it is paralyzed and does no defensive work. If black plays bishop takes bishop, his best move, white has rook takes rook and wins the exchange. If black instead plays rook takes rook, white doesn't recapture bishop takes rook yet. First he plays bishop takes bishop, check. Using the priority of check to gain a move. Black has to move his king, and then white still has bishop takes rook waiting for him. White to move. What is the best move? Examine every check. White has 3 with his queen that cause it to be lost without creating plausible offsetting benefits. Checks that lose the queen usually can be dismissed quickly unless they lead to mate or other enormous gains. But then consider bishop moves to h7, check. Which requires black to play king takes bishop, moving his king onto the 7th rank. If black plays king moves to f8, white looks for his next check and finds queen moves to h8, checkmate. With the king moved to a new rank, white looks to see whether any other black pieces might now find themselves pinned. He sees that the pawn on f7 would be paralyzed. Next he asks what the pawn protects or protected and sees that the bishop on e6 would have become loose. So he can play queen takes bishop, winning back his bishop and gaining a winning position with his queen and rook both trained on the loose f7 pawn. Again, the critical point is to study the checks you can give and whether they cause movements by the enemy king, or interpositions in front of it, that create pins, and then to ask whether any pins that result leave other enemy pieces underprotected. White to move. What is the best move? Here is a more advanced study that combines the pin with a discovered attack and shows how a pin can be used to immobilize the defender of a square you would like to have. The D file should be an attention grabber, the collection of pieces lined up there, and the kernel of a discovery in particular. White's knight masks his queen, he would be poised to play queen takes queen if the knight were out of the way. The trouble is that if white plays, say, knight takes at c6, check. Black can both erase the threat to his king and move his queen out of trouble with queen takes knight. It would be different if the pawn on d6 were out of the way, for then knight takes at c6 would create a pin as well as a discovered attack and prevent the queen from doing any defensive work. This is the value of studying the whole D file, not just individual pieces in isolation. You then see that black has his king at one end of it, and this suggests the possibility of the pin. So how can the d6 pawn be removed? The first thought when an enemy pawn needs to be moved is to take something it protects, of course, but here it protects nothing, no pieces, at any rate. There remains a second method for white to consider, though, which consists of putting a piece and prize to the pawn and inviting it to capture. This naturally is most effective where the piece imposes a threat at the same time. White thus plays rook moves to e5, sticking his rook next to black's queen and threatening to capture it. If black plays pawn from d6 takes rook, white's discovered attack knight takes at c6 now works because of the pin. Black then has no choice but to move his king, after which white has queen takes queen. Black can also reply to rook moves to e5 with queen takes rook, but then you examine the resulting board and see that knight takes at c6, check. Still works, not as a discovered attack but as a knight fork. White has knight takes queen a move later, and after the recapture ends up with a queen and a pawn in return for his knight and rook. The two passed pawns he has left on the queen side ensure victory. Notice that all this works only because black has such a limited range of responses to rook moves to e5. Although black's queen is in the middle of the board, its position is quite cramped. There are no safe squares it can reach once white's rook is on e5. But if the pawn on f7 weren't on the board, black would be able to evacuate his queen to g8 and white's plans would be foiled, though knight takes at c6, check. Still would win a pawn. A collection of pieces of the sort we see on the D file here often will give rise to more than one tactical possibility, especially when the king lies at one end of it. In this case, a discovered attack, a pin, and a knight fork all are among the ingredients of the winning idea. Black to move. What is the best move? Pinning a pawn to take its protectorate. We have looked at cases where you pin pieces in order to take what they are supposed to protect. But the power of pins against pawns for the same purpose mustn't be overlooked, either. Pawns serve critical defensive purposes, they make ideal guards for pieces. If you can pin a pawn, you thus may be able to leave an enemy piece exposed to capture. To the left is a simple example. Black scans the lines out from White's king and finds a pin of the g2 pawn already in place. The automatic question is what the pawn appears to protect, what pieces, what squares, and how you might take advantage of its paralysis. Here the g2 pawn protects the knight on h3, or rather it's supposed to protect the knight, but can't. Black takes it with queen takes knight. Black to move. What is the best move? The cluster of pieces around White's king seems full of potential for Black. But the most important piece is elsewhere, it is the bishop on g6, because it pins the pawn on c2. If you are thorough in following out the lines from the king, you will not miss a long distance pin like this. Why is it so critical? Because now when you study the cluster around the king, you realize the c2 pawn is doing no defensive work, anything it appears to protect, it doesn't. What it appears to protect is the pawn on b3, which is attacked twice, by Black's a4 pawn and his rook on c3, and in reality is defended just once, by White's bishop. Black therefore is free to play pawn from a4 takes at b3, and if White replies bishop takes at b3, Black wins the bishop with rook takes bishop, check. White cannot recapture and will suffer more losses soon. Slightly better for White after Black's initial capture would have been king moves to a1, but it's still a lost position. Black then plays bishop moves to b4, unmasking a rook pin of White's bishop on a2 and preparing a discovered attack against the White rook on d2 and behind it the other rook on e1, example our pawn from c3 moves to c8. White to move. What is the best move? As white, you might be thinking here about your two rooks and how to coordinate them. There almost is a back rank made with rook moves to e8, check. But black's rook on a8 prevents it. Meanwhile, your bishop on g2 might seem an afterthought, serving a largely defensive purpose since it is not aimed toward black's king. But in fact the bishop plays a useful offensive role, as often is the case when it is fianchetted, sitting on g2 or a comparable square, and especially when the center has been cleared. The bishop is pinning the pawn on b7 to the loose rook behind it. This is not beneath your notice, for it means that the pawn is incapacitated and protects nothing. So look at what it ostensibly protects, the pawn on a6. White can take it with rook takes at a6. If black replies pawn from b7 takes rook, he loses his rook. If he replies rook takes rook, this would permit immediate checkmate by white with rook moves to e8, checkmate. So the original rook takes at a6 wins white a pawn. Black to move. What is the best move? Black's queen is pinned by white's bishop on c4. Black can't play queen takes bishop because the bishop has protection from the pawn behind it. This is a desperate situation, so think hard about what resources black has available. First, his bishop on e4 pins the c2 pawn. This is important. It means the pawn, despite appearances, is defensively inert. If it weren't there, in a sense it isn't there, what would black do? He would eliminate the bishop's defender with check via rook takes at b3, check. Of course you might reach the idea as well by just examining every check you can give. Since white would be in check, he would have no time to play bishop takes queen, and since the pin of his pawn would prevent him from playing pawn from c2 takes at b3, he would have to try something else to defuse the threat to his king, e.g., bishop takes rook or king moves to a1. Either way, white's bishop is left unguarded, so now black can play queen takes bishop after all. It's true that if white chooses bishop takes rook, black loses the rook, but in addition to having saved his queen, he ends up with a forced if longish mate. His queen, bishop, and pawns close in for the kill in 6 moves.